Aside from this very personal monologue about sex, I am fascinated by sex on a political and social level. So I read stuff about it, including an article I came across on GQ magazines, quite a respectable magazine, that was titled How to Master FaceTime Sex in Isolation. Basically, it's an article about how to have cam sex, I presume. Problem number one for me is that I don't really have... I don't even like calling people with no video in any situation. Like, I just don't like to call people. I don't like to... I've always felt uneasy about the phone. That's what I mean. I've had nightmares about telephones and answering machines from an early age. Don't ask me why. I don't know. So, cam sex or phone sex are just two things I'm not into because they're too frightening to me. I've tried both a couple of times, not into them. But this article prompted me to think about how FaceTime sex is like a piece of performance art. Still, there are some things about this how-to guide that baffle me. Firstly, in theory, during quarantine, we can't touch. In theory. Even if you are quarantined with a loved one, you can't have sex. But this guy right here proposes that we can stay sexually stimulated even when remote, right? The guide begins with housekeeping, inverted commas. The camera never lies, so do some test shots. Work out your angles. Remember that bad lighting is a truth serum and that you have to present the most erotic version of yourself possible and that the devil is in the detail. Now, already I'm completely turned off for two reasons. One is that this sounds like too much of an effort already. Two, if you present a virtual better version of yourself, aren't you just setting the other person for disappointment for when you actually meet them in person? I mean, you know what I mean? It's like, because whether you two know each other already, physical contact, in my mind, would still be the ultimate goal at the end of the quarantine, no? Moving on. I just had a deja vu moment. Moving on. The best advice of the piece of the article that I'm talking about, and a simple one that somehow I never actually thought of, is that because you naturally can have physical foreplay before you get into the virtual sex act, you should send each other audio files or video files, which therefore act as a prelude to an interactive exchange between the two of you, forcing one in the part of the voyeur. That's interesting, and I think the most helpful part of the article. A nice way to build anticipation. Another part encourages the viewer or the reader to use sex toys, even remote-controlled ones. I don't know if there are remote-controlled sex toys for guy parts aside from fleshlights. In any event, I've never actually owned any sex toy at all. The most controversial thing in this, like I masturbate occasionally with gloves on. Does that count? But again, too much of an effort, I think, having sex toys. Then there's a whole part about unleashing your inner cam model self, which has the worst line of the piece. And I quote, "Play a role if it suits you. Knock a few years off your age. Ask them what their fantasies are. Respond as their imagination can riot." Nothing wrong with the second part of that statement. But what is this thing about having to knock a few years off your age? A running theme of your piece, and that sentence goes to show, is that you have to physically change yourself in order to be attractive. But isn't that too psychologically demanding? Shouldn't you be appreciated for who you are when you are having sex with someone, whether physically or remotely? If you think my monologue about remote sex here was too crude or even controversial, I would argue that, number one, we should always talk about sex more openly, because sex is a natural thing whether you want to have it or not, or no matter which way you want to have it. It's all good, as long as it's consensual to me, and except the obvious exceptions, which I won't get into now, but you know what I'm talking about. But also, we should really question the ways in which people who talk about sex talk about it at all. This article to me, even though it means well, is just an example of how terrible sex is talked about in the mainstream media. GQ, you have failed me. You have let me down.